Always my soulmate. By Watermelon's Melon Villain. Chapter 8. Once Upon a Dream. Yuri first became aware of the strangeness of his dreams when he realized that he could not hear anything. He was probably 6 years old when he realized for the first time that his dreams were incredibly strange. And, like any other child who wanted to know something, he immediately went to his mother and asked her if there was something wrong. And that was when Katsuki Yuri learned for the first time that what he was seeing in his dreams was actually him leaving his body and entering his soulmate's body. It was a strange sort of phenomenon that had been officially recorded as a real event in the last 100 years. When the age of science and exploration came upon the world, many questioned the validity of soulmates and tried to disapprove the idea as much as possible. However, eventually, it was too reoccurring to not be true, and therefore the theory became the fact. Of course, there was the cute little assumption that the soul left the body in order to join up with its other half for a while. Many cultures liked to believe that the two parts were meeting up in an attempt to bring each other together. Well, Yuri thought that was a cute idea. He didn't necessarily believe that personally, but it was something nice for romance novels and little kids who dreamed of having a nice soulmate when they grew up, who wanted to live happily ever after. Still, the situation had baffled him at a young age. What good was knowing about the life of his soulmate if he could not hear anything that was going on? It was like he was in the body of his soulmate, but he had no control over what was happening. And it really got him thinking. What did his soulmate see when he was sleeping? What parts of Yuri's life had his soulmate been witness to? And the thought process led him down a very dark road where he buried himself in his bed for 4 days at a time because he did not like what he was considering. When someone fell asleep, they found themselves watching the world from their soulmate's perspective. It was a very interesting kind of thing, but it was also uncomfortable because you felt that you were moving. You felt that you were doing something, but you were not the one in control. And it was a strange sensation to not be in control of what should be your body. From everything that Yuri had witnessed about his soulmate, he knew that the other was not Asian, and he was quite certain that his soulmate was a boy, just like him. Again, like any child that wanted to know the answer to a question, he went to his mother. Yuri had shyly looked up at the woman and asked her if it was okay that his soulmate was a boy too. He asked if it was bad, and he remembered her answer very clearly. "You-kun, a soulmate is supposed to be your one, the one for you and no one else. They are meant to possess what you lack, just as you possess what they lack. There is never a bad soulmate for you. Your other half completes you." That had lightened Yuri's perspective on the entire situation considerably. He no longer felt that it was strange that sometimes he would end up seeing his soulmate's body. However, he was very uncomfortable with the thought that his soulmate was able to see his own body. And the thing was that he'd never seen his soulmate in a reflective surface. And it wasn't like Yuri slept for very long. He was a light sleeper in general, so he did not sleep for hours and hours at night. But it was still very strange. One would think that in the course of 6 hours, somebody would somehow manage to walk by a window or a mirror, or maybe look at themselves in the reflection of a well-polished car. But his soulmate was rarely ever around anything like that whenever Yuri was asleep. Something else that he'd noticed about his soulmate was that his country was a little strange. And also there was a lot of snow. It was very cold. His soulmate was surrounded by Westerners. At least he was certain they were Westerners. Yuri had noticed that for about half the year they would walk around bundled in thick coats and equally thick scarves. And then the other half of the year they wouldn't wear much. He couldn't even begin to guess where his soulmate lived. He just knew that the area apparently went through extreme changes in climate from very cold to very hot. There was no transitioning like spring and autumn. It was just one thing to another and back and forth. A 10-year-old Yuri had finally gotten fed up one day. He had fallen ill and had been bedridden for almost a week. In that time frame, he dreamed the most he had ever dreamed in his life. He saw strange-looking buildings and snow, cute dogs, scary girls, and an old man who looked like he really needed to take a load off and a good onsen. Yuri tried to remember the writing of the signs he saw. He tried to remember things he'd seen in hopes that he might be able to look them up. The problem with having a soulmate who was obviously a foreigner was that learning whatever their native tongue was would be difficult. It was sometime a few years later that's his friend Yuko rushed up to tell him that she had found a new figure skater to idolize. She then proceeded to drag him to her house, sit him down in front of the television, and force him to watch this new skater. And he was made to watch a small clip about said skater's life, showing the city in which they had grown up and the buildings they proceeded to frequent when they wanted to go out to eat. That was the first time in his life that Yuri finally had an idea as to where his soulmate came from, because he'd seen those very streets before, but he'd only seen them in a dream. His soulmate was a Russian figure skater. Yuri had known about the figure skating for a long time. In fact, watching through his soulmate's eyes as his soulmate executed very interesting practices was what made Yuri's interest in ballet move on to figure skating. And while he still did ballet from time to time, his practices were mostly with Yuko for figure skating. This new revelation for him was what made him even more determined. Also, he may have kind of had a crush on someone not his soulmate, but that was okay. It wasn't like Yuri would ever meet Viktor Nikiforov anyway, so admiring from afar was alright. Viktor was astonished at how many people were not in his soulmate's life. When he'd learned that he would be seeing the life of his soulmate through his soulmate's eyes, he had gotten really excited. He would get to learn new things and see different people, but instead his soulmate was a very singular type of person. His soulmate did not go out and party like others did, nor did he play with other children. In fact, Viktor often found himself staring at a barre, and on that barre would be a long leg stretched out perfectly. His soulmate was a ballet dancer. Well, for several years, his soulmate was a ballet dancer. But then his soulmate started taking up ice skating, and Viktor had a feeling that the difference in time zones was what made it so he did not get to see much of his soulmate's skating. But what he did see, he could admit that he was impressed with it. Especially since he noticed that his soulmate was actually younger than him. That part was made obvious when his soulmate was still sitting in a class of 30 students and doing mathematics, or when he would sit down at lunch with a friend and they'd push their desks together while they ate. Of course, they weren't that much younger, no more than 4 years, but still. At Viktor's age of 19, he knew that 15-year-olds were in a sort of in-between time in their lives. With all the emotions and puberty creeping up on them suddenly, it was amazing that his soulmate could focus on class, ballet, skating, and whatever his home business dealt with. Viktor didn't understand enough Japanese to determine the younger one's job at home, though. So yes, their strides were impressive. When he was younger, Viktor had always had a fascination with sleeping. He was also incredibly saddened when he could not sleep for as long as he wanted. However, there were things to be done, and he could not while away his days dreaming about his soulmate's life. Still, he felt that he knew his soulmate pretty well. His soulmate was Asian, full Japanese origin. His soulmate was also incredibly intelligent from what Viktor had seen of his test scores. He was good at ballet and had a lot of stamina in the rink during practice. He loved food. A lot. He didn't know what the name of the dish was called, but he saw enough of it to know that it was a favorite. And the way the steam would rise up made his stomach plead for food as well. It smelled wonderful and tasted great too. It was a nice way to experience something without having it affect his own body. Though it certainly affected his soulmate's body. His poor soulmate had a slow metabolism, which made weight loss harder because any food made him put on weight, and he had to work twice as hard to lose the excess weight. Viktor didn't know of it personally, but after years of watching his soulmate struggle with scales and intense workouts, he felt that he understood to an extent. And he felt for the other boy, for the frustration and the tears he cried. He wished he could help, but he didn't know how. He still didn't know what the boy looked like. One day when he was 21, he found himself dreaming much longer than usual, enough to actually see more of his soulmate's life. School was usually the main part of each dream, but then sometimes ballet or skating would fit in there somewhere. This time, Viktor had slept for 3 hours and got to witness more than a home-cooked meal. His soulmate was an avid fan of him. Very avid. So avid, Viktor would never forget it. Their room was a shrine. It had to be. Photos and posters of him were all over the walls. Dolls, a body pillow, and even a few magazines with his face prominently displayed on the cover littered the room. His soulmate's idolization of him was further expanded upon a few days later when Victor found himself watching a video of one of his performances, and his soulmate watched attentively and clapped happily when it was over. A few days later, Victor was treated to the sensation of his soulmate and his soulmate's friend mimicking his own routine. And to be honest, they did a pretty good job. He was proud that they were exploring their skills. He was proud that he was an inspiration to young skaters in the world. It made him feel like he was accomplishing more than just a victory here and there. Sometimes he wondered what his soulmate's reaction would be should he find out that he was destined to be Victor's equal. And sometimes Victor fervently hoped that when they finally met, things would go well and that they truly fit well together. Victor was tired of being bored and alone. Yuri laid in bed, the shame and embarrassment just filling him. He stared up at the ceiling, wishing that somehow it would give him the answers that he needed. He'd failed. It was bad, embarrassing. It was all over the world and would in no way be forgotten anytime soon. Still, he wasn't going to stop skating altogether, though maybe competitively wasn't meant for him anymore. He wasn't sure his coach was the right coach for him because suck it up just didn't work. Not for Yuri. He wasn't like Bijit. He couldn't just ignore his terror. Also, Yuri wasn't as amazing as Bijit, who could execute amazing jumps. Yuri's steps were his forte, but they just weren't good enough to win in competition. Yuri needed to go back to his roots and rediscover his love for figure skating. And who had been the one to inspire him in the first place? Viktor Nikiforov. With a sigh, Yuri sat up and decided to go and see Yuko. When Viktor closed his eyes, he thought he was going to see the ocean again. His soulmate had been terribly emotional these past few weeks and had gone out to the ocean many a time to cry. Viktor didn't know what was wrong, for he hadn't seen anything, but he wished he could help. This time was different, however. He was back in the small ice rink his soulmate loved to frequent, and his soulmate was removing his glasses, making everything blurry instantly. His friend was there, the one from school, the one with the kind smile. The two exchanged words for a moment before the man moved out to the center of the ice and took position. While Viktor could not hear anything, he knew immediately what this was. His soulmate was once again mimicking one of his routines, except it was done beautifully. There was emotion. He could feel it. His winning performance was finally good, in his opinion. His soulmate had added a flair to it that he hadn't had when he'd skated it personally. It felt right. Good and wholesome. Victor basked in it, reveling in how his soulmate landed all of his jumps perfectly and how amazing his footwork was. He was invigorated suddenly. He wanted to meet his soulmate, wanted to see just what they had that could inspire him once again. Of course, the next morning, he was astonished. The very performance that he had lived in his dreams was currently trending on every social media site in the world. And he knew it was his soulmate skating the routine because he recognized the girl he was skating for, had seen her face constantly over the years. Victor had been correct. His soulmate was a natural-born Japanese man, Katsuki Yuri, one of the top figure skaters of Japan, as determined by the JSF. Also, Yuri had an intense idolization of him, if Victor remembered the poster-covered bedroom correctly. So either Yuri knew they were soulmates, or he was simply a big fan. A fan who inspired Victor. And now Victor had a reason to go and meet him without seeming creepy! It happened suddenly. Yuri was no longer dreaming about his soulmate's life. He'd had a mild panic attack. The worry is simply too much. He'd even rushed out to his mother, because moms always had the answer, and asked her what she thought about it. It could mean that you are now in the same time zone. That would mean that they were sleeping at the same time. So then would his soulmate be dreaming of nothing as well? Very strange. Yuri! The brunette flushed to the arm that wound itself around his shoulders. Viktor Nikiforov, who had come all the way to Japan to be his coach, was a very tactile person. He liked to invade personal space and spread his carefree nature around. Yuri's shoulders slumped just a bit, but his light uneasiness melting away almost too easily anymore. He'd gotten used to being touched so affectionately. So often, Viktor was not happy unless he had some sort of physical contact with Yuri, and that was a fact. He didn't understand, but he stopped running ages ago. Now he just accepted it. Besides, hadn't he used to dream about Viktor Nikiforov wanting to hug him too many times, if he was going to be honest? It was nice, and it made him comfortable, if truth be told. That Viktor was just so genuinely happy to see him all the time made his heart flutter. He had very few people like that in his life. Yuri, will you come to the shops with me? I want to see what they sell in the common shops on the corners. Always so excitable. With a roll of his eyes, Yuri nodded. Viktor threw his arms up and gave a cheer. I have to get my wallet though. Nonsense, the Russian said, already taking him towards the door. Think of it as a date. I'm paying. A date at a corner shop. Wow. Only if I can have katsudon later. Viktor's gaze turned almost, dare he say it, sensual. We'll share some later. You can feed me and I'll feed you. Yuri was a blushing mess during the entire venture. He didn't know how it happened. One thing led to another, and Viktor's dates around Hasetsu happened more frequently. And those little hugs and touches between them escalated until Yuri found himself pressed up against the shower wall at Ice Castle with Viktor grinding against him from behind. And only minutely did he think of his soulmate and whether it was okay or not. But really, Viktor was very good with his hips, and he was also talented in other forms of training as well. There was a moan, and he was sure it came from his own mouth. Viktor's hands were trailing over his stomach and coasting just barely over that place that Yuri needed them most. He pressed against them insistently and flushed when he felt a small puff of laughter against his neck. No, he refused to be ashamed. For the first time in months, Yuri was finally dreaming of his soulmate's life. He was intensely intrigued and noticed immediately that he was laying down on something smooth. Above his head was a bare ceiling. His soulmate's body rolled over, and he suddenly found himself looking at himself. His body was lying there, right next to his soulmate's own body. He was illuminated by the moonlight coming in through the window, and his skin looked paler than normal. Yuri had worked up quite a tan, but in the dark of the night and by the light of the moon, he looked ethereal. A hand reached out to caress the side of Yuri's own face, and Yuri blinked, suddenly finding himself awake and staring at Viktor, who was laying beside him on Viktor's bed, in Viktor's room. There was a beam of moonlight coming in through the window, and Viktor was staring down at him as if he was something to be treasured. Do you understand? The older man murmured as he leaned in. He did. Viktor had somehow known, but instead of telling him, he'd wooed Yuri. He wanted Yuri to choose him because of love and not because of some predestined bond forged between them by fate. Yuri shuffled closer and nuzzled into Viktor's smooth throat. This was a much better revelation than he could have ever imagined. Viktor's fingers were warm and comforting as they trailed through his hair. So much better. Wake me up, Prince Charming. I've been dreaming about. Wake me up, Prince Charming. May my dreams come true. Make my dreams come true.